Flett to start opening our press conference.
Thank you very much, Grand Chief. I am happy to be here on behalf of my First Nation, St. Theresa Point First Nation. I am here to make a declaration on behalf of our community to the government. Oh, wrong glasses. Firstly, the reason that we are here today, inviting the press media, is as follows. We should not have to be here today, though, but Canada's continued failure to address our housing crisis has left us with no choice. Today, we have started a national class action lawsuit against the Government of Canada for the unacceptable state of housing on reserve. This is about broken promises, including the treaties, in the honor of the Crown to act, and the many promises made to our people. St. Theresa Point First Nation is home to 5,200 people who share just 646 homes or dwellings. Structural issues and overcrowding are the key features of our living conditions. 25% of homes in St. Theresa Point are severely decaying and should be condemned, but there is nowhere for our residents to go, and these homes continue to be occupied by the dozens of people. Canada ships materials and trailer homes by truck into our fly-in community during the 6-week period where our winter road is open. Canada sends us the cheapest materials it can find. These materials are often damaged by the time they are delivered to St. Theresa Point. This creates issues for our people before they are even constructed. To make matters worse, our homes are not designed or constructed to withstand the cold climate in northern Manitoba. We are also expected to make do with only a few new homes per year, when we actually require hundreds of additional homes. All of these factors create unsafe living conditions for our people. Most homes on reserve are falling apart, and many are infested with mold and other toxins. Our lack of housing on reserve forces generation after generation to cram together under the same roof. It is normal for our 2-bedroom houses to be occupied by more than 12 people. And in one instance, we actually have one 4-bedroom home which is occupied by 32 people. These are not healthy living conditions. First Nations people deserve better. Canada has long known about these housing realities in St. Theresa Point. But year after year, our needs are swept aside as our people get sick and as our people die. How many of us have to get sick and die before Canada does something? Time is up. When you look around our country, these are realities only known to First Nations. We cannot wait any longer. Our survival and prosperity as First Nations people depends on urgent actions today. Unfortunately, we have had to turn to the court to get our basic human right recognized. This situation is not unique to St. Theresa Point First Nation, but also many other First Nations are also in a housing crisis. We call on all First Nations across the country who share these realities to join this national class action lawsuit against Canada. Together, we must demand the housing that we deserve. Together, we must fight for our survival. And together, we can create a safer and healthier future for First Nations across Canada. So basically, that is my statement, that is my claim, and this is the purpose for which we are notifying the government and the rest of Canada about our situation, our dire situation. Now I would like to ask my Grand Chief for Anshininu Ugumawan tribal unit, of which 4 First Nations are represented. My First Nation, St. Theresa Point First Nation, Wasagamack First Nation, Garden Hill First Nation, and Red Sucker Lake First Nation. I would like to introduce Grand Chief Scott Harper to say a few words as well.
Thank you, Chief Elvin.
We'll slide that over. Nice and easy. Good.
All right, thank you, Chief Elvin Flett. My name is Grand Chief Scott Harper. I represent the 4 First Nations in my community, and St. Theresa being one of them. I stand here in support of our chief, and why this is also important for me is because it also hits me personally. And I moved here about 12 years ago. And just to share a quick story about why it's important for me. I moved here about 12 years ago, and before then I did not have running water in my own home, living in the community. The first time I had running water was actually moving here in the city. And talk about the struggles of not having running water. There's overcrowding in the home. Usually when you go home, you want to go and rest, but with the overcrowding, there is no place to rest at home. And I've heard stories of where people take turns sleeping. And in my own home, the struggles that I had to face, getting water for cleaning, bathing, washing clothes, cooking. It takes about 4 to 5 hours a day just to get water from down the lake to fill tanks. And that's to do everything such as bathing, cleaning, laundry. And when you look at the statistics of how many gallons a day a person uses, in a website, 90 to 100 gallons a day, an average person. And when you think about how much time it even takes to get water for your family, you don't have time to spend with your kids. You don't have time. The things that we struggle with, education. We'd like to see our kids have that time to study at home and to even teach them, help them with their homework, and which also causes stress, anxiety, and depression. And there's many other problems, health problems, even mold causes the respiratory problems, especially in children, elders. And then there's also relationship difficulties. And that also leads to housing insecurity. And even some community members, they move to the city to look for better housing, better homes. But also there's even problems in moving to the city where you have no support. And that even often leads to homelessness. And I've seen some of my community members go through the same problems. So I wanted to share a little about what it's like to live in a home without a proper home, without a proper, even basic necessities such as water. And this is one of the reasons why, I believe it's important to have a good home, adequate home for our community members. Again, I'd just like to thank you. And that's, I'm Thank you.
Good afternoon. I acknowledge that we are gathered here today on Treaty 1 territory, the ancestral and sovereign territories of our people. I want to thank Chief Flett and his council for inviting me to stand beside their First Nation and Grand Chief Scott Harper today to support the announcement of their national class action lawsuit against Canada for the deplorable state of housing on reserve in our First Nations across the country. But I'm here to support this First Nation in terms of their great concern and a stain on the conscience of our nations. For far too long, First Nations people in Manitoba and across Canada have endured overcrowded, dilapidating and substandard housing, undermining their health, their well-being and their dignity. We have talked and talked and talked about this for forever. And it's time that Canada wakes up. And it's time that Canada has to hear the cries of our people. We should not be in this state, in this country, or in this province when Canada has the fiduciary responsibility through our treaty relationships that we be living in good ways in our First Nations, but we haven't. The housing crisis in First Nation communities is a glaring reflection of the systematic inequalities and historical injustices that First Nation people have faced for generations. It is a direct result of years of underfunding, neglect, and the failure to successive governments to fulfill their responsibilities towards First Nation people and a treaty right to housing. How many times do we have to come and sit here? How many times do First Nations have to take the government to court to be listened to? We have done so much work over the years, submitting proposals, submitting our statistics to the government as to what housings are needed in our communities. But we're still here today, as the chief said. 2023, we're still here, and we're still begging. We administer the poverty of our people on behalf of the government. And it's sad that we have to do that. The conditions on First Nations is unacceptable in terms of housing. When we talk about overcrowding, when we talk about 32 people living in a home. Can you imagine that? You living in a home with 32 people? I don't think that people can grasp or comprehend what our First Nations people have to endure in First Nation communities. And the numbers are not getting smaller. The numbers are growing because our population growths are growing. Bill C-31 impacted our housing crises in our communities. So multiple generations are forced to share limited space. And I hear the chiefs here today in terms of the children not being able to have their little space to be able to do their homework. There's not even connectivity anywhere in these communities. Many homes lack basics like clean drinking water. We take it for granted as Canadians, the clean drinking water. Yet these people still get their waters from the lakes due to lack of infrastructure in communities. And I've been to their communities and I have seen it with my own eyes. These conditions are not only an affront to human dignity, but also a violation of basic human rights. Basic human rights. The social determinants to health that every person, every First Nation should have, which is clean drinking water, which is good housing, a good education, good health. We do not have that. It is high time that we acknowledge this reality, and that is what this class action lawsuit is about. It is a declaration that Canada has not honor of the Crown and breached their fiduciary duties to remedy the housing crisis in St. Theresa Point First Nation. The government must fulfill its fiduciary and legal obligations to First Nations, first and foremost. You will hear from Chief Flett, and you have heard from Chief Flett, the crisis that they are in. It's never ending. It's never ending for our people, where we have to come and we have to be here. And we have to show the world, the country, nationally, as to what is taking part in who we are and how we are treated. In conclusion, the deplorable housing conditions in First Nation communities demands Canada's immediate attention and action. Canada should not be giving back any money to Treasury Board when it comes to monies that are identified for First Nation people. They gave back billions. That money should be earmarked for our First Nations people in this country, for St. Theresa Point, so they can build houses. They should have an airport close to their community, but they have to depend on the winter road to take up what is needed for their community. So we cannot turn a blind eye to the suffering and injustice endured by our First Nation citizens when it comes to safe and adequate housing.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you all for being here today. I want to recognize the Treaty 1 territory on whose lands we are on, who was so welcoming to all of us. Kichimigwech to the Treaty 1 territory. I also want to thank Chief Flett for the invitation to be here and to advocate with you for this very important issue, as well as Grand Chief Harper, Councillor, Grand Chief Merrick. And, you know, and we call upon all other First Nations to please join us in this, you know, in moving forward. I guess just before we begin, I also, you know, I know that every year we advocate for, you know, to try and close the social economic gap, and that includes housing. And I know that there's been investments over the past few years, but that's not enough. The gap is so huge in First Nations communities, and we have to do things different. The way that we're doing things does not work. And so, you know, the Assembly of First Nations has continuously communicated this urgent need to close the housing and infrastructure gap between First Nations and other people in Canada. Action is required by Canada to meet its treaty and human rights obligations under international law, Canadian law, as well as Canada's commitment under the United Nations Agenda 2030 to close the socio-economic gap and to leave no one behind, and that includes First Nations. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, human rights law generally, and the United Nations Agenda 2030 essentially state that Indigenous people, like other peoples, have a right to development that includes social and economic development on par with others in our country. And this is affirmed again by Section 36 of Canada's Constitution Act of 1982. Many of the Agenda 2030 Sustainable Development Goals are very relevant to this intolerable lack of First Nations housing and infrastructure, as well as the lack of essential government services. And Agenda 2030 and the United Nations Declaration are relevant to closing the broader social economic gap. So socioeconomic gaps must be closed to realize First Nations' right to develop in our lands and territories that we have generously shared with others, and to realize our rights to equality and dignity. First Nations class actions on human rights matters include those launched by the Assembly of First Nations have been remarkably successful in recent years. They have produced precedent-setting judicial decisions, as well as settlements to bring a measure of justice to our people. This class action seeks to bring results not only for communities on a whole, but for children and youth who are in the child welfare system. Children and youth who age out and have nowhere to go because of the way Canada chooses to fund housing on reserve. We will keep fighting in court if we have to. So there's a myth in Ottawa that budget decisions marking it is largely or completely discretionary in nature. However, our wins in court and human rights standards say otherwise. So Canada has committed to fixing the infrastructure gap by 2030 and publicly stated they would not be able to fix this gap. We see that recently in media and from different ministers, but our communities and our people will be the ones who will live with that decision. So, you know, I stand with St. Theresa Point today, and I stand with, you know, with the chief as he steps forward. We need to change the way that we do housing in this country. In Canada, we have a big problem when it comes to housing for First Nations, and the amount of people that are becoming homeless day in, day out, day after day is remarkable, and it's increasing, and it's a sad situation for our First Nations people. So we have to do things different, and I think, you know, this is a call to make a different change, and in the course of the trajectory that we're seeing. So, Kichimi Gwech Gigyabin, thank you.
Thank you. I want to recognize that we are here on Treaty 1 territory and express gratitude for the honor of being here today. My name is Michael Rosenberg. I'm a partner at the law firm McCarthy Tetro. We're acting as counsel for Chief Flett and St. Theresa Point First Nation, working with the law firm of Olthius Clear Townshend as well. Chief Flett has asked me to provide a brief overview of the legal aspects of this class action. I'll describe what this claim is about, and then I'll speak to those on whose behalf it is advanced. In terms of what the claim is about, there are two pieces. There is the past, and there is the future. The past is compensation for hardships of the sort you've heard about today, that no one should have endured. And that means compensation for the First Nations, for the loss of their communities through inadequate housing. It also means compensation for their members who personally endured those hardships. And the claim seeks $5 billion in compensation. Turning then to the future, which is the most important part of this claim. The past is important to heal, and compensation is important to heal, and it will allow First Nations as best money can to move past the harm, but the future is what secures these First Nations. The future is about recognizing Canada's obligation to provide St. Theresa Point First Nation and similarly situated First Nations with funding so that they in turn are able to provide adequate housing to their people. This is about funding the construction and maintenance of housing on reserve so that St. Theresa Point First Nation and all those in the same position can enjoy the same standard of living as other Canadians. This is about recognizing that Canada must make good on its promises to St. Theresa Point and other First Nations in treaties and any number of times since that it would deliver housing. And so the future is about recognizing the rights that those promises have created. And if necessary, given the urgency of the situation, Chief Flett and St. Theresa Point will seek injunctive relief to compel Canada to recognize the urgency of the situation and the need for immediate action. Ultimately, when we look to the future and to that aspect of this claim, this is about ending the housing crisis and ensuring that it does not recur. When we ask who this claim is on behalf of, it's important to recognize that no one class action will solve all of the problems of housing on all of the reserves in Canada. This class action is directed towards the most extreme housing emergencies in First Nations. It's national in scope, but the members of these communities have been particularly affected. The members of the First Nations here at issue have lived in communities where the majority of the population endures a shortfall of 2 bedrooms or more relative to the national occupancy standard, and where the majority of the community lives in housing that requires major repairs. These First Nations have some of the worst housing in the country, and they are in the most dire need of relief. And you heard some of the stories that Chief Flett related today. These are truly catastrophic housing conditions. This is what describes the class. The class will be made up of individuals who, if the action is certified as a class proceeding, will be automatically included in the claim. And it will be made up of those First Nations that elect to join Chief Flett and St. Theresa Point First Nation in advancing this class action. And so the call, as you heard from Chief Flett, is for First Nations that find themselves in these dire housing emergencies to take action, to participate, to tell their stories, and ultimately to call on Canada to do better. That's the legal overview, and perhaps I might pass the microphone back to Chief Flett. I know we'll be pleased to answer questions as we proceed.
This one fell, wait.
Okay.
No, it fell. Wait, just go. Okay.
Okay, thank you very much to my colleagues and our legal representative for describing to very briefly the situation for which this class action has been called. I think specifically also to our First Nations people out there who are listening, and that I hope that this class action lawsuit reaches the expected results on their behalf. All the First Nations people across the country, we know what your situation is. All your chiefs know what the situation is. We ask for your support in this class action. And I thank also the press and the people of Canada for listening. At this time, if you have any questions, we can try to answer them.
Yes, I have just one preliminary question. I may understand that you speak a few words in French.
We,
Parfait, thank you. Est-ce que vous pouvez revenir un petit peu sur l'urgence de la situation? Pourquoi cette action collective de maintenant pour la programmation de
I didn't understand that.
Why urgent? Why is this
In
urgent
English,
and
that's
why
all
now?
right. I mean, like, why now? Why is this class action right now for
I believe this class action has been in the waiting too long. It's time that we move forward and see what Canada will actually do on this quest of ours to receive better housing. Actually, it's it's not too late, it's never too late, and the time is now.
Chief Flett, class actions can take some time. What do you hope happens in the meantime now that you've put this call out for other communities to join?
I believe that in the meantime, we can continue to build our strength by talking with other First Nations and other tribal councils to create a better understanding. This is where I would call Grand Chief Merrick to do this on our behalf, not just for Manitoba, but we can go to AFN, and Cindy can work in that respect for us. So it's time. Just basically, it's time to do this. We've been waiting too long for results.
Have you been in contact with other communities about it? Have you received any interest, I guess, from other communities?
I have not. I have only been talking with my First Nation, and yes, we haven't had a chance to talk to. We've only begun talking about this within the past 4 months. So with our legal representatives, just to look at the dynamics and see what we can do.
Just a follow-up question to that, but how many people do you expect to join the class action? Do you have any idea?
I don't think that any First Nation in Manitoba has adequate housing in their communities. So we would expect all the 62 First Nations that do have inadequate housing in their communities to be able to join this class action. And I don't know even at the national level if there's any First Nation that will actually have adequate housing in their First Nations.
Are you aware of what that number would be if everybody nationally signed on?
Well,
Roughly?
I guess for the budget ask, the last year's budget ask from the Assembly of First Nations was 60 billion.
Just in
And-
terms of,
and we-
bands that would be involved, I guess if everybody that was affected signed up, do you have a ballpark on what sort of numbers we're looking at nationally?
For sure, over 600 First Nations did. You know, we have over 600. I mean, there's very, very few that have, that housing works for them. 99% of our communities, this doesn't work, and we're seeing it. And we have asked for billions in investment year after year, federal budget after federal budget. And although there has been some investments, it's not enough because the gap's so huge, and we really need a different way of because what we have right now is not working. It's not working for First Nations, and it's very slow. It's not closing the gap, and we have, our populations are growing once again, which is a good thing. But at the same time, our infrastructure gaps are huge, and our housing gaps are huge, and we need a faster rate of response. Yeah, or to change a different way, like as one of the lawyers was saying today, we can't go to the banks and get mortgages. We have to go and beg for a ministerial loan guarantee. And I don't think any other Canadians, a lot of Canadians don't ever, when you tell them that, then they're open up and they're sympathetic to First Nations to say you can't go to the bank and get a mortgage. No, you can't. And we're left out of that whole system once again. And so we're always, we're always disadvantaged when it comes to that, and there are 634 First Nations in this country. Some are landless still, some are, but probably over 600 of them, all of them have been discriminated one way or another, especially through the Indian Act system.
Just a few questions on a few of the legal aspects for Michael, if possible. You mentioned the class action would be seeking $5 billion in compensation. Could that number change depending on how many communities or individuals end up being part of this? Should it go ahead?
It certainly could change, and part of the difficulty is that the statistics that are officially available tend to understate the problem. And so the questions that we've been hearing today, how big is the class, how many First Nations, it's very difficult at this point in time to say who would meet the criteria that I articulated earlier, because the data themselves are so poor. And so it's possible, as we've heard, that this class could grow beyond what is suggested by the census statistics, for example, and in turn that the compensation that is sought would grow as well. The expectation is that those who suffered unacceptable hardships would be fairly compensated, and that's the past, and that the future for them would mean that they could turn to Canada to fulfill its promises of adequate housing. And those two halves of the claim would come together for the class, however it sits, in terms of the realities of housing, the true realities of housing on First Nations across the country.
So that $5 billion, how did you come up with that number for the call-out?
It's a reflection of what we could glean from the census figures, recognizing, as I said, that they are imperfect, and contemplating, as one must with a class action, a standard measure of hardship, living in conditions of inadequate housing, overcrowding, shortfalls of bedrooms and poor condition housing, and then recognizing that there are, in addition to those basic hardships, which are bad enough, there are those who have suffered particular hardships, illness, for example, that would sound in damages to a much greater extent. And it's the combination of the basic hardships with these particular hardships that led Chief Flett and St. Theresa Point to name that number in the statement of claim.
To your knowledge, has there ever been an attempt to do a class action like this, or is there anything currently along the same vein?
Certainly. So my firm, McCarthy Tetro and Olthius Clear Townsend, represented 3 First Nations as representative plaintiffs in the safe drinking water class action. That was here in Manitoba, Tataskrak Cree Nation, as well as Curve Lake First Nation and Niskantaga First Nation in Ontario. And that action also adopted the form of addressing the past through compensation and securing rights for First Nations and their members to secure the future. And ultimately, that class action settled in September of 2021 for compensation on the one hand, and also a promise by Canada to provide safe drinking water in class members' homes, regular access to an adequate quantity of safe drinking water. And it's that model that gives Chief Flett and St. Theresa Point hope that the courts can assist in addressing this dire housing situation. As you heard, he came to the courts at the end of his road because thus far all of his entreaties to Canada have fallen on deaf ears, and St. Theresa Point, which has a housing shortage of at least 500 units, that's nearly 500 families waiting for a home, received 20 homes last year through federal funding. It's barely a dent in what they need. It doesn't keep up with the decay in their housing, let alone the growth of their population. And the First Nation, like so many others across the country, falls farther and farther behind. And so that urgency is what drives this class action.
This is for individuals, not the band, correct?
It is for both.
Oh.
So as with safe
Like
drinking
the
water.
5 billion.
So that is for both. That is for bands and individuals as we understand the class. But I don't want to focus too much on that figure, both for the reason that we just discussed, but also, as the regional chief has advised, the headline number here is the part that should really draw the attention, and that is the cost of the future. That is the cost of building adequate housing on reserve. It's a cost that the regional chief put at $60 billion.
I'm just curious though, because that money is going to be divided by, I'm presuming, members that are living. What about members, would it include members who have died during the course of this or prior, maybe even because of the poor water and housing situation?
Certainly. So the claim allows for those who have died within the 2 years prior to commencing the claim to participate in the class action, and they will be part of the class if it is certified. And that's the same approach that our firm took to the safe drinking water case, to recognize that there are those who should participate but who are sadly no longer with us today.
Can individuals sign on, or is it just communities?
Individuals can certainly express interest in participating in the action. If the action is certified, it will be an opt-out basis. They will automatically be included. They don't have to take any further step. But certainly, Chief Flett and St. Theresa Point First Nation call on those who have been affected by this housing crisis to share their stories, because ultimately, as this case advances, it will be about telling those stories and ensuring that Canadians understand what is happening in those First Nations that are suffering the most dire housing crises and the realities of living in those First Nations. And you heard that. That's in a 4-bedroom home, 1 kitchen, 1 bathroom, 32 people sleeping in shifts. These are appalling conditions that fall at the feet of the federal government. And so individuals who live in conditions like that in other First Nations should come forward. We urge them to make their voices heard and to join with Chief Flett and St. Theresa Point First Nation.
It's already said people could opt out. Who would automatically be included should the proposed class action be certified?
Ultimately, the class will be defined by the federal court, but it is intended that it will be all members of those First Nations that meet that extreme standard of deprivation that I mentioned earlier, namely that the majority of their members live with a 2-bedroom shortfall relative to the national occupancy standard, and the majority of the housing is in need of major repairs. These are the communities that have the greatest housing emergency, and they are, at present, the focus of this class action.
What's next?
So the statement of claim was issued this morning in federal court. We are awaiting the assignment of a judge. We have attempted to serve the federal government with the statement of claim. Chief Flett and St. Theresa Point First Nation call on the federal government through the Attorney General to cooperate in the immediate resolution of this action. That begins with consenting to the certification of a class proceeding, and then the hard work of crafting real solutions to end a First Nations housing crisis on reserve. And what we'll be looking to Canada for is both cooperation, but also, in the event that discussions do not proceed smoothly and do not result in a productive settlement, we'll be looking to Canada for their statement of defense. And the aim here, without getting too far into the specifics, is to ensure that Chief Flett, St. Theresa Point First Nation, and those similarly situated First Nations in Canada get immediate relief. And I heard the question earlier, class actions do take time. They certainly do. But insofar as humanly possible, we as council are committed to moving this case, recognizing the urgency of the situation and the dire need of those who are affected by this housing crisis. And so we will push this forward on 2 tracks. We will ask for defense, we will litigate this matter, and at the same time, we'll invite Canada to come to the table and resolve it. So that's what's next.
Can anyone speak to the emotional toll living in those conditions? We were at a conference some months ago with regard to suicides of young people, and I know that it was mentioned at that time that the young people don't have places to be in their homes where they can get some quiet, do their homework, that kind of thing. Can someone speak to that?
Yes, thank you very much. With regard to the emotional aspect, I've already talked to our legal counsel about some of the ideas that we can put forth early on. One of the things that we need to talk about is cases relating to mental health. Mental health, not only the state of mental health and the effects of various issues regarding overcrowding homes is become, in my opinion, quite phenomenal at this stage after observing some of our youth in the community. One of the complaints, of course, is, one of the things before I get into that is, with regard to your question, I had asked our legal counsel, Mike Rosenberg, would it be possible to include in the class action suit a piece on how to address all the past hardships creating mental health issues of our people. And he said, definitely we can look into that, and I know we can do something about that if we concentrate on that a little bit more, all the effects that have created, of overhousing that have created the mental health issues of our community. For example, what I'm alluding to is I've heard many families say, my daughter is 16 years old, she's becoming a young lady, she does not have the privacy that a young girl her age needs as part of her growing up into an adult, having to wait in line at the washroom, having to sleep with little kids in the bedroom. She needs her space. So those kind of issues create problems for young girls who are getting older, and often in their frustrations they will seek outside relief. And all too often it's drugs and alcohol, and that's part of the problem.
Just a clarification for Frenchie Harper, you talked about not having running water. You lived in St. Theresa Point, was that the community you were in?
No, it's my community is Red Circle Lake First Nation, so it is part of the Island Lake region, and we see the same issues, same thing. Actually, just to clarify that, the house that I lived in wasn't even my house. It was a house that was that nobody lived in, and it was kind of given to me just to fix up. But it was just like any other home that didn't have I guess it wasn't, it was just an old house that I had to fix up on my own, and heating, all these things. It was a big issue, and it was my story is only just one of many that the conditions of these houses are in.
And I do have pictures of the homes that we were making reference to. And that's the trailer with 12 people, the 32 people that live in that one home. And the state of the houses. A lot of times people as well, we take care of our homes, but if you have 32 people living in one home, it deteriorates faster, because you need to ensure that it's very well taken care of. And so with all the overcrowdedness, with the mental health issues of our young people that have to stay in a home with other people, they need their space. They've never had their space growing up, and they probably won't have their space by the time they leave home. We would like to ensure that our people would be given that adequate housing in our communities. And I don't know how many hundreds of years it'll take for us to catch up, but this is something that we need to ensure that the government is made aware of as to the cries of our nations here with our chief here, that on behalf of this nation and the other 62 chiefs in Manitoba. So Manitoba being the highest populated of our people at the national level of 22%. So that's over 150 people here in the province of our people, and we're the highest. We're the highest in the in the country, percentage-wise, of Aboriginal people, and our descendants signed treaty with the Crown to share the beauty of our land. Sadly, the successive colonial governments have not honored the treaty rights to health. And I'll keep on saying that, and I'll keep on saying the treaty rights to health, the treaty rights to housing, the treaty rights to education. And that's our basic human needs.
Have you been given any reason at any time on why the communities don't have running water? Or is it just one of those things that we'll just get to?
Hopefully, but it's infrastructure costs as well in First Nation communities. So you get your housing from one pot of money, and then you have to go beg for the infrastructure costs to the other pot of money, right? And a lot of times these two pots don't speak, right, when it comes to that one house. So a lot of First Nation communities don't have the infrastructure as well in their communities. So there's two, they need to combine, they need to come together. We need to be able to meet the ministerial loan guarantees. And if you have a qualified audit, an unqualified audit, then you don't have the necessary means to be able to meet the ministerial loan guarantees. So you don't get the housing, right? So it's not a win-win. It's not a win-win situation for our First Nations when it comes to funding and when it comes to housing.
Maybe I can comment on that as well. Of course, the biggest problem with the water situation in St. Theresa Point, I'll use St. Theresa Point as the example, and I know it reflects to many other First Nations in Manitoba, especially those communities who live in the north and more remote locations. St. Theresa Point is, along with the other communities, is extremely one of the most remote locations, First Nations in Manitoba. And we only have delivery service on Winter Road for the construction materials, including water and sewage capability to put on the community, to increase the amount of distribution lines so that we can service all the houses. Even the few houses that we have, not all of them are serviced by the main water distribution line or the main sewage line. About 50% or more of our houses rely on septic tanks by the house and water cisterns to be delivered every few days. That's like about maybe 300 houses that rely on water delivery service, sewage pickup service, and many of these vehicles, they run constantly 24 hours a day, trying to serve all these 300 or more houses, and they are subject to breakdown on the kind of roads that we have in the north, dirt roads. And many of the houses live off the main grid, and they have to be delivered in very, very shoddy road conditions to their houses. So that exacerbates, makes it bigger, the problem we have with water housing, housing shortage. These problems create other problems in terms of our right to have good water and clean toilets. Thank you.
I'll add that to as well. When I did mention about the number of gallons that an average person uses, so between 80 to 100 gallons. So these cisterns they have a capacity of 1,000, average usually about 1,000 gallons. So if you think about that, if they had 5 people living in the home, you'd have to fill that tank every 2 days. And to do it every 2 days of how many houses in the community, and to service all those houses, how many vehicles would you need? And that uses a lot of the funding, especially in First Nations, to keep those delivery service running. And again, it's a 24-hour, pretty much a 24-hour job just to keep that running. And when they break down, how much it costs to keep building, to keep replacing. So a lot of that funding that we talk about to keep that system running, it's a lot of money. And that doesn't even, that also accounts to the infrastructure that the First Nations get. So a lot of it is actually spent that way as well.
So I don't know if there's no more questions. Any last comments by anybody? Well, thank you very much. And I hope everybody is well today. Thank you.
Thanks for coming.
Yep. Thank you.
Always. Thank you.